The B-18 Bolo Bomber was the first medium-sized bomber the Douglas Aircraft Company ever created. It was designed to become a central component of the U.S.'s air power. But after its development, the aircraft was in the shadow of far superior bombers, like the B-17 Flying Fortress. The plane soon became a footnote in American aviation history. By the start of the 1940s, the Bolo was considered underpowered for modern war. The aircraft was deemed unsuitable for the role it had been specifically built to fulfill. However, in the lead-up to World War II, the U.S. military continued to rely heavily on it. Then, during the attack on Pearl Harbor, most B-18s were destroyed on the ground. Eventually, the Bolo was relegated to serving as a training and reconnaissance aircraft. And despite its usefulness throughout the years, the bomber has now been forgotten. Won by a hair. In 1934, the U.S. Army Air Corps issued a requirement to improve the mass-produced Martin B-10, which had become the Army's staple bomber. Although it had just entered service, the U.S. was looking to double the B-10's bomb load and range. The bomber selected from the competition would reinforce the air forces in Hawaii, Panama, and Alaska. Douglas, Boeing, and Martin each presented prototypes capable of carrying 1 ton of bombs at 200 miles per hour over a distance of 2,000 miles. The contract winner would be decided by a fly-off at Wilbur Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. Of the 3 prototypes, Boeing's B-17 Flying Fortress was deemed to be the superior aircraft. This was thanks to its 4 large engines, which exceeded performance expectations. However, a tragic accident cost Boeing their contract. The B-17 prototype took off with the controls still locked and crashed. In light of that event, the contract was awarded to the Douglas Aircraft Company's B-18. Douglas quoted a unit price of each B-18 at $1.09 million. In contrast, Boeing had quoted the unit price of a B-17 at $1.86 million. In the context of the Great Depression, Douglas's pricing worked in its favor. The Army was also excited about the B-18's potential, so they signed off on 13 developmental aircraft. Later, the Air Corps ordered an additional 177 B-18 Bolos, despite early technical problems during its development. The aircraft was based on the successful DC-2 commercial airliner, but had a greater wingspan of 4.5 feet and deeper fuselage for accommodating 4,500 pounds of bombs and a 6-person crew. 2 Wright R-1820 radial engines powered the aircraft. It also had a nose, dorsal, and ventral gun turrets. Entrepreneur Preston Tucker was granted a contract to develop a remote-controlled gun turret for the bomber. 2 more contracts were granted in the following years for 217 B-18 Model A's. This was a modified version of the original Bolo design, which had a cramped bombardier position. The B-18A came with improved 1,000-horsepower Wright Cyclones and feathering propellers. The bombardier's position was moved further forward, over the nose gunner's station. This redesign of the nose gave it its characteristic profile. On February 23, 1937, the first production of test and evaluation B-18As were delivered to Wright Field. There, the Army conducted airborne maneuvers and experiments with powered turrets. The immediate availability of the B-18 series of bombers allowed the Air Corps to train bomber crews on it. Later that year, the Bolo was sent to operational groups. The 7th Bombardment Group at Hamilton Field, California, was the first to receive the aircraft. The Bolo had a maximum speed of 217 miles per hour, a cruising speed of 167 miles per hour, and a combat range of 850 miles. It became the most deployed American bomber type outside the United States during the early years of World War II. However, the Bolo's multiple design shortcomings meant that the B-17 Flying Fortress would ultimately be the superior aircraft. Shortcomings. By the time the U.S. entered World War II, the Bolo was in service with every major command, including 9 reconnaissance and 34 bombardment squadrons. The aircraft played a stopgap role, while the B-17 was being further refined and produced in larger quantities. At the time, companies were having difficulty keeping up with the demand for new bombers from the U.S. Air Corps. In November 1939, in the interest of keeping the production program alive in the face of the finally emerging B-17, Douglas also worked on a radical redesign of the aircraft. These newly designated B-23 Dragons were faster, had a larger wingspan, and had the first tail turret seen on an Air Corps bomber. The tail gun was a .50 caliber machine gun with a telescopic sight. However, the improved Dragons still couldn't keep up with newer medium bombers like the North American B-25 Mitchell or the Martin B-26 Marauder, so they never entered combat overseas. The Dragons went into service with the 17th Bombardment Group for coastal patrol and training missions. Still, they were soon found unsuitable for long-range bombardment. Its upgrades would not save the Bolo program. Coastal Patrol. By 1940, only 3 years after it entered service, the Air Corps considered the original Bolo model antiquated and underpowered. Its defense armament was deemed inadequate, and the aircraft came up short in range, speed, and bomb load. It was also outclassed by more modern European planes. The Douglas Aircraft Company hoped to still sell large numbers of the B-18 bomber to Britain, but they only managed to get a 20-plane contract with the Royal Canadian Air Force. There, the plane was designated Digby Mark I. These bombers were sent to the 10th Squadron as a replacement for the Westland Wapiti, a British single-engine biplane. The Digby Mark Is were mostly used in reconnaissance missions in Nova Scotia in response to the appearance of German U-boats in North American waters. The B-18s from the Royal Canadian Air Force were the first of their kind to see action in the air during the war on October 25, 1941, when Squadron Leader C.L. Annis attacked a U-boat patrol. A year later, the bomber sank a German submarine U-520 found east of Newfoundland. In total, the Canadian Air Force conducted 11 attacks on U-boats. Despite this initial success, however, the Bolos were only used for a short time as anti-submarine bombers. In 1943, they were substituted for the consolidated B-24 Liberator, a heavy American bomber with a wider range and bigger payload. This new aircraft also closed the Mid-Atlantic Gap, an undefended area beyond the reach of the Canadian anti-submarine aircraft. Pearl Harbor. Even though it eked out a minor utility role throughout the war, the U.S. military's Bolos never really stood a chance getting off the ground after being nearly wiped out at Pearl Harbor in 1941. The first Japanese raid over Hickman Field destroyed most of the B-18s based in the Pacific. During that raid, 32 Douglas B-18s were destroyed, along with 20 USAAC Boeing B-17s and 12 Douglas A-20 Havocs. 10 hours later, the Japanese launched an attack at Clark Field in the Philippines, where 12 Bolos were parked. The Japanese sank or damaged a total of 3 light cruisers, 3 destroyers, 8 battleships, and 188 airplanes. Only a few Bolos survived the attack, but they wouldn't play a significant role later in the war. The remaining bombers in Hawaii and Alaska were sent in reconnaissance patrols to anticipate possible attacks on the mainland U.S., but such attacks never happened. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, a fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy engaged in a fight with the U.S. Navy near Midway Atoll in the North Pacific Ocean. Hawaii-based B-18s were sent to search for the fleet. When enough B-17s finally entered service in November of 1942, they entirely replaced what remained of the Bolos in the Pacific. From then on, the Bolo would be used for different roles. The leftover B-18s in the Philippines were modified to be used as armored transport between Mindanao and Luzon. The Bolo served the same role throughout the Gilbert Islands and Marshall Islands campaigns. When the resistance collapsed in the Philippines, Air Corps pilots were evacuated in B-18s to Australia. Like the Royal Canadian Air Force, the United States also operated the B-18s as anti-submarine warfare bombers in North America and the Caribbean. They had their bombardier replaced with a search radar and a radome that protected the radar antenna. In October of 1942, the Bolo was incorporated into 4 squadrons from the East Coast and 6 from the West Coast. Another 15 Bolos were sent to the Caribbean, under the command of Lieutenant General Frank Maxwell Andrews of the Caribbean Defense Command. Ironically, Andrews had supported developing the B-17 over the Bolo in the 1930s. A B-18 was responsible for damaging a German U-156 commanded by Captain Lieutenant Werner Hartenstein. The U-156 had infamously been responsible for sinking the British RMS Laconia with 1,800 Italian prisoners on board. On October 2, 1942, Captain Howard Burhana Jr. was piloting one of the B-18As of the 99th Bomb Squadron. It came in contact with and subsequently sank a German U-512 submarine north of Cayenne, French Guiana, during its patrol mission. 2 B-18As were also sent to the Brazilian Air Force in 1942 to secure shipping throughout the Western Hemisphere. Under the Lend-Lease program, the U.S. supplied Allied nations with oil, food, and military material. In August of 1943, following an unprecedented agreement, the U.S. Army turned all of its anti-submarine warfare aircraft over to the Navy. The Navy formed squadrons of B-24s and consolidated PB-4Y Liberators, finally leaving the Bolo out of the game. The B-23 Dragon, the improved version of the bomber, was also involved in non-combat roles. By the end of 1943, Bolos and Dragons were sold for cargo hauling and crop spraying to commercial operators. Some Canadian Digby's were used for training or converted to cargo transports under the designation C-58. Surplus Dragons were also modified to accommodate 12 passengers and washroom facilities and were used as corporate aircraft. Only 6 Bolos still exist today. One of them lies in the jungle of Hawaii's Big Island, where it crashed on February 15, 1941. The 7-man crew was rescued, along with the bomb site and instruments. However, the rest of the wreck can still be found there, sitting near the impassable Kohala swamps. And although the B-18 has been largely forgotten, it had an honorable service career in the U.S. Army.